That's it. We're ready to go. Cole, why don't you share with us what we're doing today, and then possibly maybe a little bit about who you are and how you met and how we met, et cetera, and prime us and take it away.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so my name is Cole Benoit. I am the owner and head bitters maker with Apothecary Bitters. I also work with Long Table Distillery here in Vancouver. I designed the first Amaro in BC for them. We just did an absinthe in which I grew about 95% of the botanicals. We just did an orange curacao and a few other things, so I work with them as well. As far as Apothecary, we are based in Vancouver. We started about, I think, 5.5 years ago now. And just met John through the scene. I mean, everyone in Vancouver and across Canada knows John, so we met. He liked our product, and it went from there. And it's been great. I love all their products, and so getting them to distribute us across Canada has been awesome. And I've done these spirited sessions a few times now on bitters across Canada. And today we're going to kind of open it up. Just talk about maceration in general, infusions, aromatized wines, bitters, and making amari at home. And I'm going to talk about some kind of techniques and hacks. I'm going to talk about some general ones, but I'm also going to talk about, I really wanted to focus on, possibly using stuff that you have around home or that you might find, in your yard, or kind of ways that you can make do with what you have. Obviously, we're trying not to go out and go to the store right now, and the internet does exist for certain things, but it's a fun challenge to just figure out ways to use what you have at home already. And so that's kind of, we're going to talk about the basis of making these things. We'll have a very wide range of knowledge in this seminar, so some of it you might already know, and some of it you might not. So I'm going to kind of go over the basics, and then we'll talk about some kind of cool and interesting things. As John said, we have an Indiegogo right now. Basically, I'm always making bitters at home, just coming up with new flavors. But from a commercial point of view, we don't want too many products in our lineup because it gets hard on retailers. It can be confusing. It's harder for sovereigns. So we did this Indiegogo to just basically a way for me to get these flavors out that I really liked, but I didn't want to put into our lineup just for a logistics sense. So the link will get posted. We've got botanical cola bitters. We've got a tropical tiki, a winter forest, and then if we hit our stretch goal of 2,000, which I think we're at 1,750 right now, so not that far off, there's a desert sage bitters, which I really, really like, so hopefully we'll hit that stretch goal. But go check it out. As well, I know that a lot of us are out of work right now as bartenders, so if you're interested in any of these Indiegogo bitters, but you don't have the means to donate right now, just send me an email, cole@apothecarybitters.com. We're going to make a little bit extra to set aside so that people who might not be able to buy them right now can buy them in the future from us directly. It was just going to be exclusively through this, but I know that people are going through some hard times, so I want to make sure that people who wanted them have a chance to get them as well. All right, well, we're pretty much ready to go. So we'll start with what is maceration, also known as an infusion. Basically, it's taking botanical ingredients, infusing them into a solution, usually alcohol, to extract the flavor compounds from them over a period of time. So we're going to discuss 3 different products today. We're going to discuss making bitters, making amari, and making aromatized wines. So bitters are an alcoholic preparation of botanicals. Now, they were traditionally medicine. That's what they were originally created for, and most of the bittering agents that are used in them were medicinal. That's why they were used. They're usually now obviously used for cocktail flavorings, and they're typically between 25 to 50% alcohol. And bitters differ from tinctures in that they use A, bittering ingredients, and B, that they have multiple ingredients in them. A tincture is usually just a single ingredient. Amaro is the Italian word for bitter. It's a herbal liqueur flavored with various botanicals as well. There's a lot of overlap in these botanicals as well that are used traditionally, so that's kind of, it's easy to, if you've got a couple of them, to kind of delve into these. But those usually have a bittersweet flavor, and they're usually around 16 to 40% ABV, and they're either as a digestive after dinner kind of thing traditionally, or now they're used a lot in cocktails. The third is aperitif wines or aromatized wines, which are basically a fortified wine infused with botanicals to add more flavor. And again, these were traditionally medicinal. That's how they were consumed. So a couple types are vermouth, which traditionally contain wormwood, which is where the name comes from. And then we have quina wines like Lillet or Dubonnet, which use quinine. Cinchona bark is where quinine comes from, which is also in tonic water and is also a cure for malaria. That's how it was originally used. And then we have Americano-style wines such as Koki, which use gentian as its bittering. So a lot of those families were created around the original bittering agents that they were used. As well, these are usually between 15 to 22% ABV. So, as I said, a lot of these ingredients, the bittering ones and the medicinal ones, overlap between all these different products. So if we have one or two of those, that allows us to kind of expand what we're making quite easily. So all of these are made by infusing our botanicals in alcohol. We're going to talk a little bit about ingredients later, but right now we're just going to kind of focus on these technique things. So bitters are the most concentrated and most intense. Amaro's going to be less intense, less bitter, and a bit sweeter. And then vermouth's going to be obviously the least intense as you're diluting it a lot with the wine. So from the very basic procedure, super simple. It's been done the same way for a long time. We're simply going to take some sort of inert vessel, glass or stainless steel. I wouldn't recommend plastics since you're using alcohol. We're going to add our botanicals and our bittering agents, and then we're just going to let it steep in the alcohol over a period of time. Now, the way I do it is I like to do it in two stages. I add my alcohol and then let it steep for a while, then add water, and then let it steep again with the botanicals, because I find you get a kind of more of a depth of flavor when you've got the two different stages, the two different dilutions. So that's how I've always done it in the traditional manner. And we're going to discuss this traditional way first, as it's the most basic, but then I'm going to talk about some other techniques that we can use to kind of tweak things and speed them up as well. Okay, so we're going to start with bitters today. I'm going to make each one of these as we go along. I've already got my ingredients measured, but I'm going to actually do them. And as well, a little later at the end of these, John's going to, or somebody's going to post from the team, a recipe. Basically what I did was I went through all my recipes for my bitters, for my vermouths, for my amaros, and I kind of averaged them out and made ratio recipes for you. So that almost like a Mr. Potato Head style, so 1 part bittering to 4 parts flavor to 10 parts alcohol, that sort of thing. So you can kind of take whatever you have at home and play around with those formulas, and it should get you pretty close to good based off that average. So
Cole, do you want me to share that now?
No, we'll do it towards the end.
Okay.
I just kind of wanted to talk about what
cool.
what they're doing. So so bitters, let's start with those. Obviously, that's my main area of expertise. So bitters should be concentrated in flavor, and they should have a decent amount of bitterness. Now, they can have a little bit of sweetness to them, and obviously when they were consumed straight, they would have had a little bit more, but we do want them to be fairly intense. A dash or two should do it in a cocktail. So for bitters, we want to use as high proof an alcohol as possible. And the reason for this is we're trying to extract as much flavor and aroma from those ingredients, and we also want the final product to be fairly high in ABV as well. Like I said, between 40 and 60% is traditional for bitters. So we don't want too much dilution at the end. So we want as high a proof as possible. We also want it to be as neutral as possible. In bitters, the alcohol is merely a solvent. It's there to pull out the flavors from our botanicals and our bittering ingredients, and it's not there as a flavoring agent. So we want it to be as neutral as possible. Now, I realize that with current situations and also the laws in Canada on proof, it can be hard to find some of that. So not everyone has jars of 190 proof NGS at home, like I have the luxury of doing. You start to see Everclear here and there, but for this purpose of this, just use whatever the highest proof you have at home that isn't too strong in flavor. In an ideal world, like I said, we would use this, but we're working with what we have. So you don't want something that, like, don't use mezcal or something for bitters, because obviously that's not really what we're going for. But anything that's on the more neutral side and as high proof as you can, that's what we want to use.
Cole, if I was going to acquire industrial grade ethanol for the purpose of making large amounts of bitters,
Yep.
what would be a good resource for me to do that? A, and B, what's like the minimum that I would need to get?
Well, there's not really a minimum. It varies by province, so it's all controlled by the provincial liquor. So in BC, I think in Alberta you can buy fairly high proof, like just Everclear off the shelves. I've seen it crop up in BC a few times. We have a permit, so basically from the BC government, we had to get a permit to buy commercial alcohol. You have to have a reason why you're buying it. So for us, it's using bitters. Labs and things like that can apply that are using it for lab purposes and stuff. And then basically it has to get delivered to a specific address on the permit, and you're allowed a certain amount per year. Oddly, when we started the bitters with Apothecary, that was the easiest permit for me to get. Strangely, they were just like, yeah, sure, buy 150 liters 5 times a year of pure alcohol. It was all the other city stuff that was way harder than that. So oddly, but yeah, it'll vary from places to place. If you already have somewhere you can get it, great. I think 80% or 70 to 80% is the highest you can get on the shelf if it's available in your province. You can't get the 190. If you're ever in the States, you can always stock up too, but just use whatever you have that's the highest proof. If you want to share that bitters recipe now, you can.
Okay.
So the bitters that I'm gonna make today is based off this thing. So there you go, basically the ratios. So 1 part bittering agent to 8 parts flavor, 30 parts if you're using 70% to 20 parts water. So these are all based off of weight, which is always going to be the most accurate. If you have a kitchen scale, it's best to use it. But it's close enough with most of these ingredients that if you're using it by volume, it'll get you close to. But if you have a scale, definitely use it. Otherwise, let's say 1 tablespoon bittering to 8 tablespoons flavor, etc., etc. So I'm going to make a lemon and cherry blossom bitters. That's what I've got here. So for bittering, I've got rhubarb root and dandelion root, and then 1 part of that, and then we've got the 4 parts of the flavor, and I used just cherry blossoms here right now. So I used those that I dried out: lemon peel, green tea, jasmine, coriander, and lemon verbena. So for bitters, I've already, like I said, measured my stuff out. And for this one, we're going to use 65 mils of neutral grain spirit. So I'm going to measure out.
Those oxos are the best, aren't they?
Yeah.
The graduated cylinders, yeah.
They're really, really useful. Now the plastic gets kind of like milky after a while, but they're cheap enough you can just replace them.
Yeah, I like using them as jiggers behind the bar.
Okay, so as I said, we're going to start with the traditional simple ways of making these products, and then I'm going to talk about some kind of technique improvements and hacks that we can do. That's how you make bitters for the base part. So the way that I do it, 2 weeks with our high proof spirit, and then we're going to add the water and dilute it down to our later strength. Let it sit for another week still on those ingredients, and then we're going to strain it, fine strain it, double strain it through either like a micro mesh or a coffee filter, and then add any sweeteners that you might want in it, and you're done. Put it in a dropper bottle, and away you go.
I'll just share that again with people here. So
the recipe?
Go. Yeah, there we are.
So yeah, so this was based around that proportion. And like I said, I mean, I've got probably 40 bitters recipes that I went through and took all the averages of for all these ratios, so they should get you pretty close. Obviously, with use a little bit of judgment. Certain things like the cherry blossoms in this are a little lighter, so you're gonna need more volume of it, but it'll get you close enough.
Cole, what kind of bittering agents are out there that are easy to acquire? What are the most common ones? I don't know if you're going to talk about that
Yeah,
or not.
we'll do ingredients in the second part. So this whole
Okay.
part will just be technique, how we're making it, and then I'm going to go into ingredients and how we can hack those at home too first off. So this was dandelion root and rhubarb root though. Okay, that's honestly the very basis of making bitters. It's actually a pretty simple technique. Just at home, all you need to do is put it in the vessel like that, let it sit, and then add some water, let it sit again. So now we're going to talk about Amaro. Again, similar technique for the most part traditionally, but we'll change a couple things. But we also want a softer bitterness and a rounder flavor profile. So I like using a slightly lower proof alcohol with Amaro because I don't want to over extract. And we're going to let it sit for a shorter amount of time. Now, I always want some dilution for the most part for Amaro because, like I said, I actually find you get a greater depth of flavors when you have it at a higher proof and then you add the water and then a lower proof and let it sit for again. So, but I don't want it over 25% in a drop. Then you're adding too much water, too much dilution. So if I want my Amaro at about 35 to 40% ABV at the end, I use a 60% spirit. And if it's 35% or under, I'll use a 40 to 50% spirit. So this makes it a little easier to make at home as well, since most of us have those types of spirits. Obviously, the alcohol is going to play a bit more of a role in this because there's more of it, and you're usually using Amaro drinking on its own or using more of it in a cocktail. So we want to pay attention to it a little bit more. Now, again, any good quality neutral spirit will work, but you can play around with stuff a little bit more too. Historically, brandy is going to be the most common, just since Amaro came from Italy mostly, and there's lots of grapes, so grape spirits are going to be the most commonly used. But you can use less aggressive whiskeys, and today I'm actually going to use a Sovereign product, Caña Brava rum,
Yay.
which is a really nice light rum. It's delicious. It's going to add a little bit of flavor, but it's not going to overpower it, and it's going to add a bit of sweetness too. So what I've done, and I've already done this, is I've taken that Caña Brava and then just fortified it with a bit of NGS to bump it up to 60%, since I'm going to be making a stronger Amaro with this. And so I just added grain alcohol beforehand. So what we're going to do with this one is we've got another recipe. If you want to share that, John.
Yep. Sure. Yeah, it's this one. There we go.
Yeah, so there you go again. More ratios, makes it nice and easy. Obviously something you can tweak, like the sugar if you like a sweeter Amaro or a less sweet Amaro. And then I've added an additional ingredient, a couple of these things that I like to add in. Dried fruit adds some nice depth to Amaro. So I'm making sort of an Averna Ramazzotti style Amaro right now because I don't have any at home at the moment. So kind of more on the side of like cola, sarsaparilla, root beer, that sort of thing. So we've got cinchona, quassia, and cherry bark in here for bittering, fairly traditional, which we'll talk about later. So something about citrus. You can use dried citrus or fresh citrus. It doesn't really matter for that part of it. I just saw that pop up. We got orange peel, sarsaparilla, cola nut, birch bark, coffee beans, nutmeg, cardamom, cinnamon, Mexican cinnamon canela, angelica, vanilla bean, and then dried peaches. So I am going to add our fortified rum to our mixture. You'll see things that tell you to shake this stuff every day. You don't need to do that. As a commercial bitters producer, I can't really shake 100 liters of bitters every day. When it's full of pears and stuff too, it weighs a ton. So you can agitate it if you want, but I usually just let it sit and rest. So for the Amaro, we're going to let it sit for 1 week. And then we're going to add our water to proof it down to our final strength, let it sit for 1 more week, and then we'll strain it out and add our sweetener just as we did before.
Cole, there's a question here, and I don't know if you covered it because I was on the other screen here. It's from Quinn Palmer. He's asking, if you start your extraction at a high ABV and then dilute down with water after,
Yeah.
He's assuming that the liquid will loosh and go cloudy.
Uh,
Um,
yeah, but then it settles out.
okay, so it just settles out, so you just need to wait.
Yeah, well, yeah, because it's all these have like at least a week with the water in them, so it'll settle out after that. It does loosh. Usually, not everything looshes. It depends on what it is. If you've got a lot of citrus in there, it'll loosh. But after it sits for a week, like the lime bitters that we make, it looshes when we dilute it down like crazy, and then it all settles out after a while. It's usually just the agitation with the botanicals as you add the water that makes it loosh. If you have some sort of like fining agent at home too, like if you brew Irish moss, you can use gelatin, any things like that. If you want it really clear, you can use those after you strained it out to really get any leftover particulate out. But for the most part at home, I'm not too concerned with it being perfectly clear. We do use fining agents in Apothecary for most of them, but at home it's less of a thing. But yeah, you can use that as well. As well for Amaro, you can play around with different sweeteners to add different flavors to your Amaro at the end. So when you go to flavor, use honey, agave, maple syrup, cane sugar, molasses, whatever. Always think of your sweetener as a flavor too, just like you do in cocktails. It is going to add something else. So with this one of the kind of cola things, I might use a brown sugar or like a Mexican sugar, the pionchillo, that sort of thing to get a little more flavor out of it. Plus, it would work with the rum nicely. So always think about your sweetener as an ingredient other than just sweetness as well. All right, so next up, which it's funny that Quinn's in here since this is what he does, and their vermouth, Esquimalt vermouth, amazing. My favorite vermouth that I've had in BC by far. So it's kind of funny, but we're going to talk about aromatized wines now. And I actually think that this is one of the most fun and kind of rewarding things to do at home. I kind of started with it, and Quinn and I have actually been talking via email. I just sent him it's getting shipped out today, some bitters in exchange for some vermouth. But for a long time, there wasn't a lot of local options for vermouth, and a lot of the giant companies can be a little lacking in kind of depth and complexity. I think they've toned down their formulas over the years to kind of bring the bitterness back to like appeal to a wider palate. And a lot of the import stuff, Koki, it's got a little bit better, but at least in BC was like 60, $70 a bottle. And that's a lot to spend on vermouth sometimes, especially if you're not drinking it. I just drink it neat, so I can go through it pretty quick, but it does go bad, so getting through it. So I kind of started making my own vermouths to kind of offset that and just kind of play around. But it does allow us to custom tailor the vermouth to our tastes or a cocktail. If we have a cocktail in mind, we can kind of tweak the vermouth to that. Also, you can take a single bottle of wine and split it into 4 different variations of vermouth, and now you've got 4 different types of vermouth to play around with at the end. So it gives us a lot of options that way. The other thing is it allows you to decide what type of wine you're going to use. And most large commercial vermouths use a fairly similar base wine, and it's not usually the best quality of wine. So you've already got kind of one leg up over, Rosso or Cinzano if you're using a better quality wine. And now you don't have to use a $100 bottle of wine, but even if you're using like a $15, $20 bottle of wine, it's going to be a better wine than they're using. One of the things too, for me, using red wine to make sweet vermouth was revolutionary. It was a game changer for me. Despite what you might think, all sweet vermouth generally is made with white wine. They just add caramel coloring, and that's where the color comes from. But it's just a white wine as a base. I find that the tannins in red wine actually make it work a little bit better in a cocktail a lot of the times. So I really like to use red wine when I'm making sweet vermouth. Dubonnet does use a red wine, actually. That's not a vermouth. It's what did I say? A Quina. But yeah, just playing around with the different varietals and kind of types of wine, you can do all kinds of cool stuff. I've made port vermouth before. I think there's one sherry one on the market now, but you can use sherry. So it's a cool way to experiment with stuff, and again, whatever you have wine-wise. So again, technique is fairly similar, but it's going to be, again, lower amount of time, a lower amount of proof, and a lower alcohol. So usually with this, I just start with a 40% alcohol because when we add the wine, we want to bring it down to our proof of 15 to 22%, the range that vermouth is in. So we're not adding water to this, we're just adding the wine, but given the ratios, I guess, John, you can put up the sweet vermouth one, and this will give us the ratios, but we need enough alcohol in the beginning to at least cover our botanicals, right? So we don't want half the botanicals sitting above it, so we need enough of that. So we want a lower proof just so that we can add the wine and get it to where we want. I'm going to be using the Cagna Brava again for this one, and just at strength, since it's already at 40%. I think it's 40, right?
43.
43, close enough. That works. Again, brandy's going to be the most common for aromatized wines, because most of them came from Italy or France, so wine growing regions. So you're going to have brandy as the most common. I keep it a little more subtle here, just because the wine, we want to have a fair amount of effect. So I wouldn't do anything crazy with this. The Amaro, you can play around a little bit more, but we want it fairly subtle. And I've already taken, so normally we would add our alcohol, let it sit for 3 days. That's how I do it. And then add the wine and let it macerate for another 10 to 14 days. And then strain it out, sweeten, and go from there. I'm going to do a technique hack with this one, which we're going to get to in a second. So when I'm doing this particular technique, we're going to talk about doing sous vide. That's how I'm going to do this for vermouth. So I've already mixed my rum and my wine together. So we're going to use all our botanicals and ingredients at the same time when we do the sous vide. So I'm just going to add this into our jar. I'm using a red wine here. It was a Spanish Cab Sauv that I had around. Give it a stir. And that's basically it. A lot of vermouths will be aged in oak and stuff traditionally. That can add some cool flavors. It also changes, and you're going to get oxidation and stuff like that. So it gives you a different final product. It's going to be a lot brighter when you make it at home and it's unaged. So it depends on what you like. If you have a little mini barrel at home, you can play around with that. You can also just add oak chips. That's usually what I do at home for any of these, is just throw in some oak chips to kind of get that flavor. Okay, so we're going to talk about some hacks, and we'll get back to that with the sous vide in a little bit. So there are some things we can tweak, and there's some things we can't tweak. Alcohol is pretty much always going to be our solvent. It's pretty much the best solvent out there, and most of these products are alcoholic, so it does the best job, and that's what we're going for in the end. Glycerin's not actually a very good, it's not really a solvent, and companies like Fees actually take highly concentrated alcoholic concentrates, and then they use the glycerin as a fixative with those. So they're adding a small amount of a really intense alcoholic concentrate and then cutting it with the glycerin, which also basically, because the oils will come out of suspension, so it keeps everything together. Glycerin's also a laxative, so it's not something that I personally like using anyways, and depending on the pH, you can actually get bacterial spoilage from it, so you could get botulism and stuff. So I just stay away with it and just use alcohol. So if we can't manipulate that, what can we manipulate? Well, time. And obviously the biggest hurdle for a lot of these things at home is that amount of time. Like bitters, 3 weeks to make a batch of bitters, and then you don't like it at the end, so you got to wait another 3 weeks. So I do think there is something about the slow, natural extraction of flavors, and that's why with Apothecary we still do the 3 weeks, but we don't always have the luxury of that, and sometimes at home we just want something quick. So sous vide is kind of my favorite technique for that. Sous vide is also known in, well, it's a water bath, basically. And what we're doing is we're heating up the water to a lower temperature range, and then keeping our ingredients sealed in a vessel inside of that. We don't want to overheat it, otherwise we'll extract too much bitterness and harshness from the things. And we also can't take a pot of NGS and bitter ingredients and boil it, because we'll just evaporate all the alcohol. So it needs to be sealed. So sous vide allows us to do that. Now, not everyone has an immersion circulator at home. If you cook, I highly recommend getting one, because they're amazing. But you can do it on the stove with a little bit of patience and a digital thermometer as well. It'll just be a little more work. So I'm going to do it in I've got an Anova here, and I'm going to set it to 135 degrees. And then basically I'm just going to take my vessel. Once it's up to temperature, I'll just throw it in there. Now you can actually put it in beforehand because it's a lower temperature. It's not anything. And then I'm just going to put it in there.
This is 135 Fahrenheit that you're setting it to, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, they're all, yeah, 135 Celsius would be pretty hot. And then I'm going to let it sit in there for 2 hours. And if you're doing it on a stove, take your temperature probe. Once it gets close to the upper range, around 140, take it off the heat. You want it on the lowest heat you have, and then put it back on. If you have a warming thing on your stove, sometimes those will get warm enough to actually be able to do sous vide with it. But yeah, don't let it get too much over temperature. You'll just have to kind of remove it, put it back on the heat, remove it, put it back on the heat. A little more work, but you can still do it at home. And basically the heat is extracting quicker. Heat speeds up chemical reactions, so it takes less time to do this extraction when we've added a constant nice heat to it. So that's one way we can do it to speed up things. Another way is to use pressure. Using like something like an ISI canister, we can apply pressure to our ingredients and our alcohol, and that'll force the flavors and compounds out into the solution. Now, I find that this method, because it's so quick, kind of creates a more one-dimensional flavor, and I don't like using it for bitters or Amaro or anything like that. But what you can do is make a master bittering tincture. So you can take some bittering ingredients and then put it in the canister and make this master tincture. I'd use about 3 to 4 times the ingredients you would use for bitters, so a pretty high ratio of bittering to alcohol. And then you can use that master bittering tincture to make all your other products. It doesn't work as well with bitters since you kind of want so much of it, but if you're using or making a vermouth or making an Amaro, you can kind of infuse your flavor ingredients and then just add the bittering tincture until you get the level of bitterness that you like. I'd let it sit for a little bit after that, just to kind of let the flavors go together, but it'll give you a nice master bittering tincture. So just take your ISI canister and then your cartridges. I do 3 of them, shake after each one, and then degas. Make sure you've got something over the nozzle when you degas, just a shaker or something so that you don't spray bittering tincture everywhere. But that's a way to do kind of a quick master bittering tincture that you can use for a bunch of other options. Yeah. Okay, so that's kind of the techniques section. So we can open up some questions now, if there's some kicking around.
Any questions about master bittering tinctures? I'm making sure they're not. No, good. Nothing so far.
Okay. I mean,
okay,
a lot of...
One other thing I'll add, by the way, just on the sous vide hack at home, and again, I was on the other screen, so I might have been distracted. But you can actually induction burners, if you go to Canadian Tire or something like that, are quite inexpensive now. And if you just have one of those magnetic pots, you can actually set a temperature on one of those stovetop or the portable ones that you might take on camping trips. Those are really, really good to use too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I think the Anova I got on sale for like $130, so you can get them pretty cheap now too. There's like fancy ones with this has Bluetooth or something. I've never used the Bluetooth because I just
because in case you want to party. Well,
it's just got a dial on it. I just put it to what I want and leave it. And like if you like steak, you can set this to exactly the temperature you want your steak, and you'll never overcook it. So it's a great way to do it. You can also, I was going to say, get if you have a sous vide setup and a vacuum sealer, you can get lids for mason jars to suck the air out. Obviously, the less oxygen we have in our vessel, the better. So you can do that. You can try and use the vacuum bags, but I found with liquid and stuff, it just makes a mess. So I just don't use a jar. But
another super like even a hack of a hack is if especially if it's lower alcohol, if you use food safe Ziploc bags and you're putting it, if you put the bottom of it into a very, very hot solution and just leave it open, right, all the heat will force all the air out, and that'll be the best. I mean, it's not as good as mason jars, obviously, but at the same time, you can try and get as much air out as possible to try and reduce the amount of air that's inside the bag. And there's the plastics industry is a whole different seminar. It's actually really, really fascinating, the plastics industry, but there's not really any sort of concern with really, really high grade plastics of putting them into baths.
Yeah, you can use like a stainless steel water bottle too,
Yeah.
anything like that. Someone I think mentioned instant pot. Yeah, if you've got an instant pot that you can set a temperature at too, that works. The only benefit of the sous vide is you're getting circulation. So the water, it's got a propeller in it, so it's constantly moving the water around your whatever you're heating. But basically the idea here is that we want a controlled water bath around our ingredients to speed up the extraction rate.
Micah has a question here. Can you go over the pressure hack again? And I know exactly what you're talking about, and I don't have any props. Maybe I'll try. Evan or Alec, I know you're on the screen. I don't know if you can find a video to show the pressure hack. It's actually it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't
go through it one more time.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have an ISI, so that's why otherwise I would have held it. But it is a useful technique.
It's a whipping cream canister, by the way, for those who don't know what an ISI is. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot that part. Usually you use it for carbonated water or whipping cream. It's just a metal vessel, basically, that allows you to put N2O cartridges, like the little ones that you would use CO2 in a pellet gun or that sort of thing. And then you screw it in, and then it shoots it into the canister and keeps it at a high pressure, which is how you get carbonated water super quick. But in this case, we're using it the more pressure it's forcing the liquid into the ingredients and forcing those compounds out. So pressure allows us to pull them out way quicker. As I said, I find that it's a much simpler kind of one-dimensional flavor. So I don't like using it I wouldn't throw all my bitters. There are people that have done this and companies that do it. I just find it doesn't give you the best result. So I like using it just for the master bittering tincture. So I just put my bittering ingredients in my alcohol and then kind of make a really intense bitter tincture that I can use for my other things. I think someone said carbon dioxide. Yeah, you should be able to use that as well. I would think. I mean,
and N2O is, at least in my experience, N2O is a better cartridge to use. And when the moment you pull the trigger, you're forcing the liquid that's in there into whatever solid, right? And so so long as you just put a cup underneath the nozzle for any spray off, right? The moment that you inject the gas in and then pull the nozzle, right, what you're doing is, as I said, you're forcing the liquid into the solid. So it like you said, it's almost better for tinctures because it is one dimensional. One very common thing that people use it for very easily is if I want to make a coffee tincture, for example, right? It's the right amount of bitter, and I can get unique different flavors. I can use different coffee beans. And I can throw coffee beans into an ISI canister with really high grade alcohol, charge it up with N2O, and then spray it. It's also, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of Green Dragon. You can Google that one. It's definitely a very creative way of infusing spirits very quickly. Someone asked a question: could you use the oven at a very warm setting? Instead of using a sous vide bath?
I don't think that's going to give you the same thing. The water in contact with the outside is going to affect it in a different way than just heating it. I've never played around with that, but I would assume that you wouldn't get as efficient of an extraction in that amount of time, just the way that it conducts through the glass.
And then I see JVH is here. Hello, Jeff. The Clever Barkeep is on. Do you have any tips on making? You know, we talked about fees being oftentimes fees mistaken as being only glycerin, right? They do use there is alcohol in them. Are there any tips that you can give on making 100% non-alcoholic bitters or Amari or vermouth?
I mean, without distillation equipment, it's pretty hard to really. I mean, water isn't that great of a solvent. I mean, you can heat. Again, using heat, you could just use a water bath, like water in your vessel, and then put your ingredients in, and then extract it that way. You're never going to get as much flavor out of them without alcohol. Alcohol's just a great solvent. It's also a preservative. So if it's just a water-based thing, it's going to spoil and dissipate a lot quicker. And especially if you're adding something like an Amaro, if you're adding sugar, just sugar and water is a breeding ground for bacteria. And alcohol helps preserve it. So if you made an Amaro like that, you'd have to consume it, keep it in the fridge, and you'd have to consume it really quickly. Traditionally, a lot of these other ones that are non-alcoholic, like Fees, they're taking alcoholic, really concentrated ones, and then they're cutting it with water and glycerin. So a lot of them still have a little bit of alcohol, but otherwise, a lot of these, I don't know what you want to call them, the word I'm thinking of, like seed lip and stuff. They're probably hydrosols. They're using a distillation technique most likely to get a lot of those out there. So unless you have a still at home, which most people don't, it's a little bit tricky. Like I said, you can do it with water, but it's never going to be quite the same without using alcohol.
And I actually just misspoke. Seedlip, specifically Seedlip, is not a hydrosol. It is a non-alcoholic distillate. And the reason the reason it's not a hydrosol is because Seedlip actually does use alcohol and citric acid in the still, and they just distill out the alcohol. So it's a non-alcoholic distillate, not a hydrosol, and there is a difference. It's not like how they make orange flower water. So
yeah. And so they're basically using the alcohol to pull those flavors out, and then using the still to get rid of the alcohol.
Daphne has a question. How many cartridges can a canister hold? If you just go to like London Drugs or Canadian Tire or something like that, again, I'll just
I would just follow the manufacturer's instructions on that one. I'm not. There's a lot of that stuff too. I mean, like you're not SodaStream. You're not supposed to use anything that's not just water. I've done it. You just have to use a less amount. They say not to, but I wouldn't. When you're dealing with like a pressure, it's always better to err on the side of caution rather than have something explode. So I wouldn't overcharge it.
And then Jason Laidlaw has a question too. If you're putting loose ingredients in a sous vide solution, would you put them in a cheesecloth bag at all? Does that make a difference?
Well, you're not putting it directly into the water bath. It'll always be in some sort of vessel. Personally, I like as much freedom for the ingredients as possible, just so that you get more surface area in contact. If you put it in cheesecloth, I mean, if you keep it really loose, you can definitely do that, or a tea bag, and then you can just pull it out. But I like having, basically everything loose so that, if it moves around, you're getting as much contact as possible and things aren't bunching together. You mean like putting cheesecloth inside the vessel you're putting in the sous vide, I assume?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could. Just like a tea bag would work just as fine. I just usually generally do it loose, and then because you're gonna have to fine strain it like through a coffee filter or micro mesh anyways to get all the particulate you want out. So you're still gonna have to strain the liquid after. So.
And Quinn has a good point here. Just to go back about the non-alcoholic vermouth, is you can get a bit of a better non-alcoholic extraction if your non-alc solution has a very low pH. So it's a really good point. So in any case, that's a good amount of questions. Continue on, please.
Sure. I was just gonna say something too. Now I forgot. So it was something to do. The sweetening thing. I always do it after I've fine strained because the thinner the solution is, the easier it is to strain. So I would strain everything out, run through the coffee filter, and then add your sweetener and let that combine. Just because, again, with Amaro or something, as soon as you add sugar, you're making it thicker, and getting it through a coffee filter is going to take way longer. I also, just off note, that's how I do all any sort of compound syrup too. I always heat up my liquid, steep it, and then I strain it, and then I add my sugar while it's still kind of warm. But just makes it easier than trying to strain it through a coffee filter with a bunch of sugar in it. Okay, so let's move on to ingredients then, which there's some fun stuff here that we can play around with at home, and I'm going to talk a lot more about hacks in this kind of section. Um, I happen to have, I don't know, 150 plus botanicals in my house. There's a bunch, all the bittering stuff, and then in the cabinet below my bar, yeah, I've got about 100 and something jars of bags of stuff. That's not most people. It's my job, and this is what I do for a living, so I have the luxury of just pulling out whatever I want. Most of the time, I'd tell you to go buy some cinchona or some gentian and make bitters or amaro that way, but because of our current situations and trying to stay at home and not overload the postal system and all that, I wanted to try and figure out ways that we could kind of take stuff that we have at home and use them for bittering ingredients. So bittering ingredients we'll talk about first, then we'll talk about flavor, but obviously the bittering is the most important thing in all of these because it's what makes them what they are. Bitters without bittering agents aren't bitters. Same with amaro. So there's a lot of things that you might have at home that we can actually use, and you might not even think about it. I mean, in North America, we tend to mask bitterness with fat and sugar. It's not the most common flavor in North America. So there might be stuff that you can use that you wouldn't even think of. One of the first ones is citrus. I mean, usually we're trying not to take the pith off with our citrus, but in this case, there's bitterness there. I wouldn't use entirely that because it can get a little bit astringent, but especially in things like bitters where you're trying to get a really intense bitterness, you can just use some of the pith to bitter them. I wouldn't use it, as I said, just for the only thing for vermouth and amaro, but it's a great starting point. Other things that you might have at home that they're going to add their own flavor but are fairly bitter are coffee and tea. Either of these can be used in conjunction with some other stuff as a bittering agent, and most people have those at home. The tea actually adds some tannins too, which adds a bit of structure to things, and I actually like it in a lot of different vermouths and stuff as well. We use tea in a lot of our bitters too. Other things at home you might have cacao, hops. If anyone brews, hops are a great bittering source. Obviously, that's what they're in beer for. A lot of people use them now for lots of flavor for IPAs and stuff, but they were traditionally for the bitterness. Walnuts, cucumber or apple peels both have some bitterness in them. Unsweetened cranberries, things like that. Kind of look at your cupboard and say, is this thing bitter? Can I use it? Also, another one that I came up with this for this seminar, and it's an interesting one, is a lot of us probably have tonic water. You can take tonic water, put it in a saucepan, and reduce it down into a really thick syrup. And now you've got a really concentrated bitter syrup that you can use for, it's not going to work so well for bitters because we don't want to add a bunch of sugar to the bitters, but for vermouth or amaro, you can add that syrup as your sweetener and your bittering agent. And again, you can kind of tweak it on the levels by using that. It's going to add a little bit of flavor, but it's mostly citrusy if it's in the tonic water. So that's one that people usually have kicking around, or it's easy enough to get if you have to do a grocery run, and then you can use that for bittering for vermouth and amaro. Another thing is, a lot of times when I talk about bitters and teach bittering seminars, is that a lot of it's historical. So a lot of these bittering ingredients were used for medicinal reasons, and that's why they were used in these things. Cinchona, as I said, was used for malaria, and that's where tonic water came from. But that doesn't mean they're the only things. They're just historically important, and they're still used because of that. There's a lot of stuff out there around us that we can use to bitter things. And I'm not going to give anyone a lesson in foraging, especially over the internet. But I'm going to mention some things that have no poisonous lookalikes in North America, so that you're not in any danger. I mean, still make sure you're double checking, but these don't have anything that's close to them that's poisonous. So first, and the simplest, dandelions. If you're in a part of Canada that's still covered in snow, they're not popping up yet, but my yard is covered in them right now. Both the leaves and the roots of dandelions are extremely bitter, and you can use those to bitter anything. The bitters that I did today, I used dried dandelion root in it. So that's a weed. It's pretty much everywhere, and that's one that you can use. Obviously, clean off the roots if you dig them up before you use them, but they'll work great. There's a side that I'm going to do here on that too, and it's kind of a technique thing, but it falls into ingredients, is that a lot of ingredients actually work better dried rather than fresh. So with the dandelion root, it's a preservation method. You can keep it around. But things like that are fairly delicate, a lot of flowers. I used cherry blossoms in the bitters today. I dried those. If you use fresh cherry blossoms, they kind of end up tasting swampy, especially in a high proof alcohol. So for things like bitters, they just end up kind of gnarly. So I always dry them out first. It's also a way that you can kind of pick a whole bunch right now, dry them out, and then use them at a later date. Now, I'm going to assume that most people don't have a dehydrator at home. I don't. So a really simple way to do this is set your oven as low as it'll go, preferably below 180. And then take all your ingredients and put them on a cooling rack over a baking sheet. We want the airflow underneath as well. And then just put it in the oven and let it sit for a period of time. I can't give you a specific because it'll depend on what it is. But, flowers will take less time. Roots are going to take a little bit longer. And I usually, just before I think it's done, I'll turn the oven off and then just let it dry the rest of the way without any heat because it'll keep it fairly warm and you don't want to overdo it. But it took me probably about half an hour-ish for the cherry blossoms yesterday. So that's kind of a good starting point for more delicate things. So that's a way to kind of preserve and dry out your ingredients for use. Fruits too. Pretty much all the bitters we do, we use dried fruit. The smoky pear, we use the fresh pears in that one, but everything else is dried, especially with bitters because we don't want to add a bunch of water to it as well. We want concentrated flavor, so dried a lot of times works better for that reason. All right, back to ingredients and bittering ones. Some other stuff that we can harvest are wild cherry bark, birch bark, obviously trees that we have around, bergamot leaves, which is also known as bee balm. A lot of people have that in their flower gardens to attract bees. Burdock and mugwort and witch hazel. Those are all native to North America that are around. Labrador tea is one that grows a lot on the west coast and the east coast as well. The branches and the leaves can be used for bittering from that. Pine cones you can actually use, and they're fairly bitter. Chicory leaves works as well. And those are just a few examples that kind of kick around and grow. Obviously, the barks work all year round because those trees are still there. So that's a good one for no matter where you are. But just make sure there's nothing similar that's poisonous if you're unsure. But all these don't have anything similar that's poisonous. So, okay, now we'll go on to the traditional bittering ingredients. The internet does still exist, so if you do want to order these things, you can. Herbie's Herbs is probably the easiest to get botanicals from in Canada. I think a quarter pound is the least you can get. But these things will last forever. They won't go bad. They're dried. So you can stock up that way. And it's important that I talk about these and at least mention just because these are what all these products were traditionally developed with. So the main 4 or 5, I guess, will be cinchona, which, as I said, is what tonic water traditionally used. That's where quinine comes from. Gentian, which you'll find in a lot of different products as well. Gentian is actually, there's a compound in it that's the most bitter compound known, and it's actually a scientific basis to measure bitterness off. And then there's quassia, which is used a lot in South America. It's a South American tree, and it's used a lot in soft drinks and stuff down there. It has a nice citrusy flavor. Wormwood, which the word vermouth probably comes from Wormwood, which is German. That's used in vermouth, and then absinthe as well, obviously. Wormwood, the amount of thujone in it is minimal, and you're not going to hallucinate. That's all a myth. It's most likely people drinking 80% alcohol and doing other substances at the time that it got banned. And then rhubarb root, which is actually one you could harvest as well, depending on what you have growing. But that's one, if you make a tincture of rhubarb root, the first thing you'll think of is Campari. There's definitely a lot of rhubarb root in Campari. The flavor is very similar, and it's got that kind of citrusy note to it. All right, so that's if there's, I can stop for a sec here if there's any questions about bittering agents that have popped up before we go into kind of flavoring agents.
You're good. Just type them in the chat. Wow, obviously you did an incredible job here. Everyone knows their bittering agents. Oh,
Yes, sir.
Ruben says for bittering agents that are a little more difficult to find, do you have any suggestions on where to find them? I know you mentioned Irby's Herbs.
Yeah.
Is there any other resources you can?
I mean, they're probably the best online. Mountain Rose Herbs, which is in the States, but their shipping is like crazy expensive to Canada. We kind of stopped using them for that reason. They do have some stuff that Herbie's doesn't have, and it's like mostly organic, but yeah, the shipping can be like $50 to Canada. Yeah, Herbie's is just probably the easiest. We've used them for years, and they work good. I mean, some of this stuff normally you'd be able to find locally, but like all those stores are going to be closed. I have a grocery store called Famous Foods by my house if you're in Vancouver, that if you have to go get groceries, they do have a lot of actually weird herbs and bittering ingredients there. But for the purpose of where everyone's at right now, I would just say just order through Herbie's Herbs.
And here's another good question I see. This is from a couple of people. How many different bittering agents would you use in your Amaro bitter vermouth? I mean, is it just one, or do you mix them up?
I pretty much always mix them up personally. I find that each one's going to have flavor too, right? So we're talking about these for bitterness, but they all have flavor to them. So like I find Cinchona very earthy. I find Quassia very citrusy. Gentian's like a very clean bitterness. Rhubarb root has a lot of like that kind of Campari sort of citrus. Sorry, my dog.
It's okay. I hear your
freaking
dog
out.
and your child. Yeah.
Yeah, my kid's yelling in the background too. They all have flavor to them. So a lot of times I'll kind of blend or pick based on the flavor profile of what I want in my final product. So, for instance, the lemon and cherry blossom bitters, I used rhubarb root and dandelion root. A, because I was going to talk about them, but B, rhubarb root's got this kind of citrusy note that's going to work really good with the lemon, and then dandelion's got a little bit of a kind of like earthy floral note, which is going to work with the cherry blossoms. The Amaro, I used Cinchona, Quassia, and cherry bark. Earthy, then citrus from the Quassia. So a lot of times I'm blending them just for that kind of complexity of bitterness. Also, there's different qualities of bitterness, right? And how these ingredients come out into the thing. If you're using more than one, you can get a little more complexity on that end too. So I tend to blend. It's very rare that I'll just use one. But again, use what you have, right? So if you can get bitterness from it, then you can use it. But yeah, traditionally, pretty much everything we do bitters-wise has usually two or three different bittering agents in it.
Cool. Another question here, and a really really good one actually, is questions about safety and making bittering agents at home, specifically when it comes to reputed toxic ones like cinchona bark or rhubarb.
Yeah, I mean, well, cinchona. The thing with toxicity too is it all depends on consumption, right? It's all in the amount. There's certain things that I've gone off before on, like using tobacco tinctures, which I highly don't recommend whatsoever because you don't know the level of extraction you're getting from the nicotine, and you're going to get more from a cigarette, like from alcohol, than you would from smoking it. I mean, you'd have to put a lot of cinchona and ingest a lot of it for quinine poisoning. Like, you're not going to generally drink this bittering tincture. You're going to use like a dash of bitters in a cocktail. So it's kind of about the consumption and the level of it that you're consuming. I mean, everything is toxic if you ingest enough of it. You could die from drinking too much water, technically, right? So it's all about the amounts. And also some of these things there's certain things, let's say sassafras. It's banned as a carcinogen for use in the U.S. Because of a carcinogen component it has. Cinnamon actually has more of that same component, and that's not banned in the U.S. It was probably something to do with root beer, and some competitor got, their other root beer because they were using sarsaparilla, and they probably got it. So there's certain things. I mean, tonka bean is banned in the U.S. It's totally fine in Canada. Same with sassafras. It's fine here. So there's different things that, depending on where you live, you're allowed to use or you're not allowed to use. And sometimes that can be kind of kind of arbitrary. Again, for most of these, we're not consuming enough of it that, for the most part, I've ever been worried about it. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time and I've never gotten sick or anything. Use some common sense, but yeah, if you're using like if you drank a liter of cinchona tincture, it probably wouldn't work out that well. But no one's going to do that, right? So
Well, you hope so, but it's always good to qualify that, especially with bartenders talking to guests here. I see that Nick Box put a really great link up. It's called cocktailsafe.org, and that's
yeah,
a project from Camper English that got sponsored by Tales of the Cocktail. It's really good. You should definitely peruse that link if you have any questions about toxicity, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a really good point. Not a lot of people know that nutmeg is actually really highly dangerous if you consume a large amounts of it.
yeah.
So it is good to know and do a little research on the ingredients that you're using. So
Yeah, I mean, if there's stuff that's just like, you don't know about, and there's certain compounds in it that, can have a negative effect, like tobacco, I just would stay away from it. I mean, I just wouldn't ever mess around with tobacco in a syrup or a tincture. I mean, if you're doing it to yourself, then that's on you, but like giving it to any other person, like it's not something I would ever do. But most of these bittering agents are safe in the amounts that you'd be using them for in a bitters.
cool.
All right.
Uh,
All right. Oh, what?
I was gonna say, look. Oh, I was gonna check if there was anything else, but go ahead. Continue. We have about 15 minutes.
Okay. We're pretty much, yeah. This is just the last part.
Okay.
Is flavoring agents. So these ones are a lot more simple, anyways. A lot of them you probably already have at home, and there's a lot of things at home you can use. So the most common ingredient across the board for all of these for flavor is going to be baking spices. They're used kind of universally in almost everything bitters wise and amaro wise. So things like cinnamon, allspice, clove, nutmeg, coriander, cardamom. You'll find all of those in pretty much at least one of them in almost every recipe like this. The other one's going to be citrus. Obviously, there's citrus in a lot of different ingredients. We probably pretty much have a little bit of citrus peel in almost all our bitters or the amaros that I do or the vermouths, just as a background. It's a nice thing. But there's a lot of other things at home that you might have that you might not think of that you can use in bitters and amaros as well. You can use dried fruits, nuts, chilies, dried herbs, spices. If you like to cook with it, you like the taste of it, throw it in. We have, I don't think it's going to get funded, but the 5th stretch goal bitters on the Indiegogo was savory garden bitters that has bay leaves, peppercorns, cucumber peels, beets and their greens, and some other stuff, a lot of like culinary based stuff. Our North African bitters, for instance, it comes from North African cuisine. I like drawing a lot on culinary stuff, and I think savory ingredients are always cool in these. There's fresh bay leaves in this vermouth that I've got going right now. I love elements like that in a lot of these, and it's stuff that people don't necessarily think of, and it adds something unique to your product. So you can take some of those things, around your house and just throw them in and see how it works. Another one, fresh ingredients that you have in your fridge, fruits, vegetables, those can all be used. Again, we were talking about kind of harvesting stuff. They use the cherry blossoms that were out right now, lavender, magnolia blossoms, things like that, if they're growing around. Chestnuts and green walnuts are both really good ingredients obviously there's a green walnut liqueur, the nocino, and they're amazing fresh. If you've never grabbed a green walnut and grated some and smelled it, it's awesome. So stuff like that too, just around you and in your kitchen, you can use. The flavoring agents is a little more broad, but I think part of this is the fun of experimenting and thinking outside the box and using what you have around you rather than just the traditional baking spice ingredients. So yeah, that's
amazing.
Pretty much it for flavoring agents. You'll find kind of everything in there. And yeah, Silk Road Spice. So I just saw someone post. I don't know if their store's reopened yet. They had so many orders that their online store was temporarily closed. But they said it would reopen in a few days. But yeah, Silk Road sells our bitters too. They've been big supporters of us. But yeah, you can order botanicals through them as well.
Perfect. I think we should probably give away some before we do any other Q&A. We should probably give away some of your Indiegogo bitters.
Yeah.
Um, Shravan is gonna play Trivia Master, and I think he's probably like doing push-ups right now. That's why he's got his camera off.
Exactly.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to see. He's just too ripped. He'd make everyone jealous. But he's we got a little trivia, and so here's how it's going to work. Shravan's going to ask a question, and then the first person to answer it on the Zoom group chat is going to win one of the Indiegogo bitters, which Sovereign doesn't even have access to. I haven't had any of these, and Cole is going to ship it to you directly. So we'll get in touch with you after this Spirited Sessions is over. So Shravan, take it away.
All right, I'm going to keep it pretty simple because we want people to just walk away with some terrific bitters here. So let's start with a really simple one first. After you add the water, how long are you waiting?
Oh, wow.
I was quick. Wait, who got that first? Was it Jared?
We can see who got it first.
Cat decided to visit.
Well, the answer is
1
1
week.
week or two.
1 week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
1 week.
1 week.
Yeah.
Shows how much. Ruben in Toronto got that one.
Nice.
So, yeah, perfect. So that's one, and we'll contact you offline afterwards. Do you have any of the bitters on you, Cole, to show to do the prices right?
Not with the labels. No, we haven't made the
Okay.
labels yet. So,
All right.
but if you go to the Indiegogo, which I recommend everyone go check out. Anyways, they're all on there.
Okay, cool. Next question, Shravan, go ahead.
All right. In the Amaro, how many parts alcohol?
Ooh, there you go.
It's a little more difficult for people.
I already saw the one that was correct.
Yeah. It's going up so fast on my screen, I'm missing it.
I think it was Nick Box.
Nick Box, yeah.
Nick Box from Edmonton, Alberta, now in Vancouver, BC. Nick, congratulations! You have also won an Indiegogo bitter here. Our people will call your people. Next.
How many of these are we doing? We're doing four.
Two more. We're doing four. We're four altogether.
All right. Let's go to a classic. What is Dubonnet made from? You got that, Ruben?
Ruben can't win twice.
No.
Well, also,
Actually, it's Billy, I think.
Well, that was. I guess
there's also some people are saying quinine and red wine, so both are technically. So whatever one was first.
Well, if quinine and red wine should both, so we'll
whoever
both
said
of them.
either of those, but said, how about we just do the first person that said quinine and the first person that said red wine? Those will be the last two bottles.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah. So Linda Garcia and is that Billy Killen? I think. Is that right? Linda Garcia,
Joel,
Billy
Linda
Killen.
and Joel, right? Joel got the Kenna.
Quinine, quinine. So I think it's. I see Linda and Billy. Cool, perfect. All right, well, I'll write those down. Now that we've flooded the chat screen, are there any other questions that Cole had or that anyone has for Cole?
And when as those come up, I'm just going to mention, I forgot to mention what I was putting in the sweet vermouth. So for the bittering, there's burdock root and barberry root. We've got citrus peel, half orange and dried and half lemon dried. Bay leaves, fresh, oak chips, pomegranate peel, cloves, eucalyptus, allspice, myrtle leaf, and clover blossoms. So that's my recipe. Again, based off those ratios that we did earlier. And then white rum and red wine.
Gord had a question. How do we buy the Indiegogo bitters? Do you just go to the Indiegogo?
Yeah,
Or,
you just pledge.
okay.
Yeah, you just pledge on the Indiegogo. So there's like different
Yeah.
options. You can get 1 bottle, 3 bottles, 5, and then once it's over, you pick your flavors. As I said, if anyone wants some but can't pledge right now, send me an email and I can set aside. We're gonna make some extra bottles, so I can set those aside for when people have money, because I want to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to buy some.
Amazing. A couple other questions here. With the sous vide method, does that add shelf life to your vermouth if you're doing that?
No.
It wouldn't make a difference. It's just
No.
it's just a more efficient way of maceration.
I mean, if you kept it sealed after that, obviously, then it's with vermouth, it's just oxidation. So as soon as you open the bottle, oxygen gets in, and then there's ways you can do it, like the oxygen savers for wine that'll help prolong the life, and you're already getting a little more life because of the alcohol and the bittering agents as a preservative. But yeah, no, the sous vide's just speeding up the extraction. That's all it's doing, is the heat.
Sounds good. And there's another question from Alexi here. With aromatized wines, are you letting your base wine oxidize before you're using it to make your aromatized wine, or are you trying to prevent it, or does it make a difference?
I'm trying to prevent it. I mean, they're in certain ones that are aged in a cask and stuff, they're usually aged in the barrel once they've been fortified too, so they're going to be at a higher proof. I just use fresh wine. I don't ever let it oxidize. I mean, a lot of those flavors we're trying to eliminate. Depends on what it is, but like dry vermouth especially, I like it way better with a brighter, fresher white wine. Obviously, if you're aging it like the traditional way, you are going to get a little bit of oxidation if you're not pulling the oxygen out of the vessel. But no, I wouldn't take a super old wine and use it to make my vermouth.
Amazing.
Make vinegar out of that.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so I think we're winding down here. Cole, thank you so much. If anyone else has any other questions, we're happy to answer them all. Evan is about to tease the next Spirited Sessions that's coming up, which is going to be a really special one in 2 weeks' time. Evan has started screen sharing. We can't see it. While that's loading, Apothecary Bitters. If you just want to buy any of the regular stuff, Sovereign is the wholesale. We're the brand manager, but also the wholesale distributor. So you can, if you email info@sovereigncanada.com or talk to any of our PMs, you'll have the ability to get it. It is a minimum 2-case order, but a reminder to everybody now, we are also Peychaud's in Canada. We represent Sazerac's non-potable lineup in Canada, so you can actually buy Peychaud's bitters that's actually Canadian labeled like a normal human. You don't have to go down to the US and get them, or have to worry about having to buy them for $12-13 a bottle, right? So you can actually get them at a normal price. So that's good.
On that note, too, for Apothecary, if you aren't someone who is buying wholesale, Cocktail Emporium, the Crafty Bartender, Silk Road, which was mentioned for botanicals, they also carry bitters. Those are some in Canada that do online sales that you can order Apothecary from.
Yeah, there's a few different delivery ones. I don't know if Modern Bartender does it. Yeah, but definitely Cocktail Emporium and Crafty, and then I don't believe Alambica in Quebec carries an Apothecary. Maybe someone in Quebec can go nag them a little bit. And then in terms of other online ordering, I think that you might be right. That might be it and it's obviously we want to try and support Canadian businesses as much as possible. So. Evan, I can't see the flyer.
It doesn't seem to want to share. It's saying it's sharing, but I can see that it's not up there. So I'm not sure what's going on with that.
Okay, well, that's okay. If we'll throw it up on our social media next week. Or sorry, not next week, but we're doing this every 2 Mondays. First of all, we'll find out at the end here, and if you go onto our social media feeds, you'll see how many. Oh, thanks, Danielle. That's great. I'm glad. Glad someone to go talk to Jean Sebastian over there. Make that happen.
I know he likes our product. I've talked to him before.
Yeah, he's just got a lot of things in the air, right? And
Yeah.
so, and our sister, by the way, our sister agency. If you are in Quebec and you do want Apothecary, Sovereign has a sister agency agreement with Molly Pitcher, with Val Chagnon and Steph Darwish. So if you reach out to Molly Pitcher, if you're in Quebec, they can help with everything to do with Sovereign. I know they're busy helping with the Montreal Restaurant Relief Fund and cooking up a storm, and they're family people too. So you can reach out to them. Molly Pitcher at sovereigncanada.com for those of you in Quebec. What are we doing 2 weeks from now? We just released Smooth Ambler Old Scout American whiskey in Ontario, which is awesome. And so we're going to bring on John Little and John Foster from Smooth Ambler Distillery in West Virginia. Smooth Ambler, which is a Pernod Ricard product in the United States, is with Sovereign in Canada. It's a little newer. Those guys are experts at blending and curating whiskey. And they're contractors by trade. So they're going to teach us all about how the contract whiskey trade works in the United States. I'm really excited for that one. That's really, really fascinating. They're very transparent people, and they're going to destigmatize and demystify all the things that have to do with contract distilling and blending from your own startup distillery, as well as sourcing and curating from other distilleries. And that one, because we don't have enough Johns on there, that one is going to be hosted by our really good friend out of Toronto, Johnny Gray from Think Tank. So it's going to be 4 Johns, 1 chat, 2 Mondays from now. Thank you again for all your support. We really enjoyed putting this on. In 2 weeks from now, we'll shift back over and start raising money again for the Bartenders Benevolence Fund. Really appreciate the support of our products, and this doesn't happen if you're not grabbing our stuff and making our stuff and playing with our stuff. We can't do these things, and so long as you continue to do that, we'll always be giving back to you. I think that's everything. Thank you so much again, and again, any questions, reach out, and have a wonderful Monday. Lots of love, Canada. Take care.